Welcome back. You're watching The Briefing here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood. Well, before the break, we were talking about the Insulate Britain protests, which seem to be spreading on weeks into the protests. Well, I'm joined now by human rights campaigner and activist Peter Tatchell. Delighted to be joined by you, Peter. I wanted to ask about the ethics of this all. We've spoken to a security expert, we've spoken to a former police officer, so now we're speaking to someone who's been on the other side of the truncheon, I suppose you could say. Is there, in the mind of the British people, in your view, support for some of this really disruptive protests?
Well, I'm sure most of the British people recognise that these protesters are acting in their interests. If the government responded to their demands and began a programme of insulating British homes, not only would it make sure that everyone is warmer during winter, it would also ensure that fuel bills are lower. So that's a plus plus for people of this country. In addition, the long-term consequences of climate destruction are almost unimaginable. I mean, large parts of Britain are going to disappear under rising sea levels. We'll lose farmland, homes, and businesses. In London alone, in East London and South London, nearly 2 million people's homes will be flooded. Nearly 2 million people. We cannot allow that to happen. And the government is taking action, but not enough and not quickly enough. So the principle, the cause of these protesters is absolutely justified. They have the right ethics.
Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide who has a just cause or not? Because by that statement, you imply that if they didn't have a just cause, if they were protesting for something with which you disagree, they wouldn't have the right to lie in roads and uphold people's journeys.
Oh no, I defend the right of people to protest if they disagree with me. I'll defend the right of people who hold views that I object to protest. The right to protest is a fundamental human right, and it distinguishes us from countries like Russia and North Korea. So I'm really grateful for the right to protest, and on many occasions there have been people like, for example, the Brexit protesters. I defended their right to protest.
With their protests, and with many protests that go on in this country, people marching down roads, for example, people saying their slogans, people holding up signs behind people on TV, it's all within the spirit, I think, of British protest. I think isn't there something slightly different, though, with these environmental protesters who, for example, Extinction Rebellion, go around smashing windows or throwing paint up on listed buildings? When it comes to actually damaging property, do you think there's a line there that can be drawn between legitimate protests that's very much in line with the British tradition of freedom of expression versus something that really comes up against the fundamental British tradition of property rights?
Well, in my 54 years of protesting, I've been involved in over 3,000 protests. They have all been non-violent and never caused any criminal damage. I draw the line there.
Having said that, Extinction Rebellion smashing windows of various companies and government departments?
Well, that is a fringe or small element of Extinction Rebellion. Most of the Extinction Rebellion protests have been entirely peaceful without any criminal damage of any kind.
But perhaps we could have some agreement here, Peter, if we're both willing to say that those Extinction Rebellion protesters who do choose to smash the windows, whether it be of banks or the Department for Transport or the Home Office, they are wrong.
Well, I think you have to ask yourself, if you're a protester, will what I do help achieve the goal, or will it be counterproductive? And I think that some of the protest tactics are sadly alienating the very British people that they need on side. And I would not use some of those tactics myself. I've always said, in cases of protest, you have to absolutely minimize any disruption to ordinary members of the public. The protest should target those who are causing the problem. In this case, the fossil fuel companies, the big energy giants, and the government.
Which is interesting because
not the British people.
Insulate Britain aren't lying down in front of the chief executive of a large oil company's driveway. They're lying down on the M25 that ordinary people use. Their explicit aim as an organisation is to cause disruption to ordinary people's lives, not the chief executives of the big oil companies. Is that wrong?
Well, that's not something I would do. I would, as you said, target the big executives of the oil companies and the gas companies, the ones who are really responsible for the climate crisis. A protest should always target the people responsible, not those incidental bystanders, like
I,
members of the public.
I wonder who gets to decide if these causes are just. If we look at the Green movement in Germany, what they have succeeded in doing is closing down nuclear power stations in that country, which has meant that tens of billions of pounds of green investment over the last decade or so in that country has been relatively futile. Emissions have not fallen in the last decade in Germany because that great low-carbon source of energy, nuclear power, has been shut down and they've had to import lots of dirty fuels from abroad. Isn't it sometimes the case that green protesters can be counterproductive not only in their actions and how they influence public opinion, but actually in the policy outcomes that they strive for?
Well, of course, in Germany, the closure of nuclear power stations had public support. The public in Germany wanted to move away from the dangers of nuclear power generation.
And
The big issue.
CO2 emissions have not fallen as a result, and Germany is doing far worse than France or the UK or many other countries around the world. If Germany, a country that used to be a leader in climate, now is a laggard. Surely this is a counterproductive effort.
Well, I think some would dispute your claim that Germany is lagging behind, but leave that aside. You're absolutely right. We do need to ensure that protests are targeted where they are going to have the best impact, and that they target those people who are responsible for the problem. You don't target ordinary members of the public if your beef is with the government and with the fossil fuel companies. I think it's just misguided and actually alienates people. It shifts the debate onto the issue of the tactics rather than the cause at hand. And I'm sure most people support the values, the principles, the policies that Insulate Britain is advocating. It's the tactics that are causing the problem and alienating people from what many would otherwise see as a positive, just cause.
Well, a really fascinating discussion there, Peter Tatchell. Thank you so much for coming on. It's really thought-provoking, the different areas we explored there. Thank you very much. Well, moving on now to the Tory party conference, which kicks off this weekend. And levelling up in the north is certain to be on the agenda. There's an entire new government department created